The wealthy Lee Jae-hyun witnessed his housekeeper Kim Ji-woo celebrate her birthday alone in the mansion's kitchen, a simple cake and a solitary candle being her only companions. Moved by the scene and her quiet dignity, he approached and asked, "May I sit with you?" Lee Jae-hyun's voice, though soft, reverberated in the stillness of the kitchen, shattering the spell of solitude Ji-woo had woven around herself. She startled, the small cake plate nearly slipping from her trembling hands. Her eyes, previously fixed on the flickering flame, now widened in shock and disbelief at the sight of her employer, mere steps away. Ji-woo's heart pounded, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. Her face, which moments before had shown resigned melancholy, was now pale, a mix of embarrassment and panic. "Mr. Lee?" The question escaped her lips as an almost inaudible whisper. She turned fully, her body tense, as if bracing for a reprimand. It was almost midnight. He was never in the kitchen at this hour. Never. Jae-hyun observed her startled reaction, the flush that crept up her neck. He knew his presence was an intrusion, a breach of all norms. But the image of her, alone, with that solitary candle, had taken root in his soul. He couldn't simply ignore it. "Yes, it's me," he replied, his voice a little firmer, but still laced with an unexpected gentleness. He stepped forward, gesturing to the empty chair across from her at the kitchen table. I saw the light on, and the cake. It's your birthday, isn't it?" Ji-woo nodded, unable to form words. Her mind raced in 1,000 directions. Had he seen her? Had he seen her singing to herself? Shame consumed her. She was just the housekeeper, and he, the magnate. The distance between them was an abyss, and now he was there, in her bubble of vulnerability. "Don't worry," Jae-hyun continued, interpreting her silence as discomfort. "I'm not angry, just curious, and perhaps a little lonely myself." He offered a faint smile, a rare and almost imperceptible gesture, but one that softened the severity of his expression. "May I sit? Just for a moment?" The proposition was as absurd as the situation itself. A man like Lee Jae-hyun, who commanded an empire, asking permission to sit at a table with his housekeeper. Ji-woo hesitated, her eyes downcast, fixed on the tablecloth. The hierarchy, an invisible barrier, seemed to vibrate in the air between them, but there was something in his voice, a disarming tone of sincerity, and the word lonely. She had never imagined someone like him could feel that. I don't know if it's appropriate, sir," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "Appropriate?" Jae-hyun repeated, a faint hint of irony in his voice. "At this hour of the night, Ji-woo, appropriateness is a flexible concept. It's your birthday, and you're alone. I'm here. It's as simple as that." He took another step, stopping beside the chair. "Please, don't make me stand." That last comment, almost a jest, broke some of the ice. Ji-woo looked up again, meeting his gaze. There was a silent determination in his eyes, but also a gentleness she had never witnessed before. She felt a strange mix of fear and a pang of curiosity. What did he want? "All right, sir," she finally said, her voice still a little shaky. She moved the cake plate to the side, making space. Jae-hyun nodded, and with a fluid motion, pulled out the chair and sat down. He didn't sit directly across from her, but beside her, maintaining a respectful distance, yet still breaking the formality. The sweet scent of vanilla cake and the soft aroma of burning wax filled the small space between them. He looked at the candle, which still flickered, and then at her face, which still bore traces of surprise and vulnerability. "Happy birthday, Ji-woo," he said, his voice a little softer than before. "How old?" The question was simple, but for Ji-woo, it was as if he were asking her to reveal a secret. She felt a lump in her throat. That moment, so intimate and unexpected, was the beginning of something she couldn't comprehend. The barrier had been broken, but the path ahead was unknown and frightening. Jiwoo swallowed hard, the lump in her throat tightening. 28. A simple number, but one that carried the weight of years of sacrifice and responsibility. Revealing it to Lee Jae-hyun, her employer, felt like a confession of her own insignificance, of her lackluster life. She was merely a cog in the vast machine of his mansion, and he was there, breaking all the unwritten rules. 28, sir, she finally managed to say, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes fixed on the candle's flame, avoiding his penetrating gaze. She felt the warmth of his stare, an intensity that made her want to shrink. Jae-hyun observed her hesitation, the way she closed herself off. He noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she held the plate. 28, he repeated, his tone thoughtful. An interesting age, not too young to be reckless, nor too old to be cynical. He paused, allowing the silence to settle, filled only by the candle's soft crackle. And you celebrate alone, no family, friends? The question, though asked with unexpected softness, struck Jiwoo like a shock. It was an invasion of her privacy, a breach of the professional barrier she had strived so hard to maintain. But there was something in the way he asked it, without judgment, just a genuine curiosity, which disarmed her somewhat. My family is a bit distant, sir, she replied, choosing her words carefully. And friends, well, a life of work doesn't allow for many distractions. She gave a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. The truth was more complex, more painful. Her life was a race against time and debt, and there was no room for celebrations or casual friendships. Every penny saved, every free minute, was dedicated to her ailing aunt. Jae-hyun nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on her face, reading between the lines of her answer. He saw the shadow of sadness, the resignation in her eyes. Distant, or too busy to care? He asked, his voice a little graver, but still maintaining the tone of someone seeking to understand, not accuse. He wasn't satisfied with the superficiality of her answer. The resilience he had witnessed moments before was that of someone carrying a heavy burden. Jiwoo looked up, surprised by his perceptiveness. No one had ever questioned her excuses so directly. She felt a blush creep up her neck. I have responsibilities, sir, she murmured, her voice almost inaudible. Many responsibilities. She gestured vaguely, as if the kitchen walls could contain the weight of her world. There's no time for parties. He observed the way she averted her gaze, the tension in her shoulders. He knew there was more. That simple cake, the solitary candle, the silent melody he had imagined. Everything spoke of a life of privation, of difficult choices. I see, Jae-hyun said, his voice now softer, almost a murmur. He slowly reached out, taking a small piece of the cake with his fingertip. May I? He looked at her, asking permission for the most trivial of gestures, yet one that felt laden with meaning in that moment. Jiwoo nodded, still stunned by the situation. He tasted the cake, his eyes meeting hers. It's good, he said, and a small, almost imperceptible smile played on his lips. Simple, but good. The compliment to the cake, made by a man who probably ate the most sophisticated dishes in the world, was an unexpected balm to Jiwoo's soul. She felt a pang of warmth, a strange sensation of being seen, not just as the housekeeper, but as a person who had strived to create a small moment of joy for herself. Thank you, sir, she replied, her voice a little firmer now, but her emotions still raw. The silence that followed was no longer embarrassing, but filled with a different tension, an anticipation. The barrier had been broken, and now they were there, two strangers in a kitchen at midnight, sharing a birthday cake and the echoes of a loneliness that in some way connected them. Jae-hyun watched her, and in his eyes, Jiwoo saw not just curiosity, but a depth of understanding that both frightened and intrigued her. He wasn't just asking about her birthday, he was asking about her life, about her burden. And, for the first time in a long time, Jiwoo felt that someone truly cared about the answer. The silence stretched, no longer of embarrassment, but of palpable anticipation. Jiwoo felt the weight of his gaze, and a part of her wanted to flee, to hide in the safety of her invisibility, but another part, one she barely recognized, longed to be heard. "You mentioned responsibilities," Jae-hyun began, his voice low, almost an invitation. He didn't pressure her, but his tone suggested he was ready to listen, if she was ready to speak. "They seem heavy." Jiwoo swallowed hard, the cake untouched before her. How to explain to a man who had everything, the constant battle against ruin? How to describe the feeling of holding someone's life in her hands, dependent on every penny she earned? "My aunt," she began, her voice a mere thread. "She's sick, very sick." She paused, searching for the right words. "There are many expenses, the hospital, the medication. It's a daily struggle." She didn't look at him, but at the candle's flame, which seemed to dance in sympathy with the fragility of her confession. The shame of exposing her vulnerability, her poverty, consumed her. She was the housekeeper, the one who solved problems, not the one who had them. Jae-hyun nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on her. The information confirmed his suspicions. The resilience, the dedication, the loneliness, it all fit. He could see the exhaustion behind the light makeup, the worry she tried to hide. "I understand," he said, his voice softer now, devoid of any trace of irony or judgment. "So, you worked tirelessly to cover these expenses." It wasn't a question, but an affirmation, an acknowledgement of her reality. Jiwoo finally looked up, meeting his gaze. There was a genuine sadness in his eyes, an understanding that disarmed her. I do my best, sir," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "She's the only family I have left. I can't fail her." The vulnerability in her voice was palpable, and Jae-hyun felt a pang in his chest. He, who lived in a world of numbers and transactions, was being confronted with the rawness of human struggle, with the silent strength of a woman carrying the world on her shoulders. "And your birthday?" he asked, his voice a little hoarser. "Is there no moment for you, for a breather?" Jiwoo gave a bitter smile. "A breather is a luxury I cannot afford, sir. Every minute is precious. Every penny is accounted for." She gestured to the cake. "This is my luxury. A small moment to not think." Jae-hyun watched her, the image of her singing to herself, the melancholy in her eyes, returning to his mind. He saw the dignity in her acceptance, the strength in her resignation. And in that moment, the barrier between employer and employee crumbled even further. He didn't just see an employee, he saw a woman of extraordinary strength, trapped in difficult circumstances. "It's a luxury you deserve, Jiwoo," he said, his voice firm, laden with a conviction that surprised her. He slowly reached out, this time not for the cake, but for the candle. With a gentle movement, he extinguished it. "Make a wish," he whispered, his eyes fixed on hers. Jiwoo blinked, surprised. The thin smoke rose from the wick, carrying away the warmth of the flame. She hadn't made a wish in years. Her wishes were always for her aunt, for her health, for the debt to disappear. But now, with Lee Jae-hyun sitting beside her, looking at her with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she never had before, she felt a strange hope. She closed her eyes for an instant, and a selfish, profound wish formed in her heart, that the burden would become lighter, that she could have a moment of peace. When she opened her eyes, Jae-hyun was still watching her. There was something in his gaze, a silent promise, a determination she couldn't decipher. The air in the kitchen seemed to vibrate with a new energy, an unexpected connection. "Ji-woo," he said, his voice a little lower, almost a secret. Perhaps it doesn't have to be so difficult. Perhaps there's a way." She looked at him confused, her heart pounding. What did he mean? Was he offering help? The idea was so grand, so improbable, that she could barely process it. The hierarchy was still there, but it seemed more tenuous, more fragile than ever. The millionaire and the housekeeper sitting side by side in a quiet kitchen on the edge of a precipice of possibilities. "Away," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible, fearing the answer and at the same time desperately wanting to hear it. Jae-hyun leaned forward slightly, his voice becoming even more confidential. "I'm not talking about a momentary breather, Ji-woo. I'm talking about the burden, about your aunt, about the expenses." He paused, his eyes fixed on hers, conveying an unwavering seriousness. "I can help, with the hospital, with the medication, with everything." Ji-woo felt the air leave her lungs. It was as if the ground had vanished beneath her feet. The offer, so direct, so immense, was almost an insult to her dignity, yet at the same time the promise of a miracle. "Sir, I can't accept," she managed to say, her voice choked with disbelief and shock. "I can't. It's not right." "It's not charity, Ji-woo," Jae-hyun countered, his voice soft but firm, anticipating her objection. It's a form of recognition. I've seen how much you dedicate yourself, how much you struggle. No one should carry such a heavy burden alone, especially when there are those who can ease it." He slowly extended his hand, resting it delicately on the table near hers without touching it. "I'm not offering this out of pity. I'm offering it because I see your strength, your resilience, and I believe you deserve a chance not to have to struggle so much." Ji-woo's eyes filled with tears she struggled to hold back. The idea that someone, especially her employer, could see beyond her role, beyond her poverty and offer such help, was overwhelming. Her pride screamed to refuse, to maintain her independence. But the exhaustion of years of struggle, the image of her ailing aunt, whispered for her to consider. "Why? Why would you do this, sir?" she asked, her voice almost a lament, distrust still battling with hope. Jae-hyun looked at her deeply, and in his eyes Ji-woo saw a vulnerability that surprised her. Perhaps I'm also tired of seeing good people suffer alone, Ji-woo," he replied, his voice a murmur. "Perhaps I'm tired of seeing hierarchy dictate who can and cannot have peace." He withdrew his hand, but the impact of his words remained, hovering in the air between them. "Think about it, not as a debt, but as a partnership. A way to ensure you can continue to be the incredible person you are without having to break yourself in the process." The kitchen, once a refuge of solitude, now seemed a battlefield for Ji-woo's soul. Jae-hyun's offer wasn't just money. It was a proposition that challenged everything she knew about her place in the world, about the nature of human relationships. She looked at him, the man who had invaded her small birthday moment, and now was perhaps about to change the course of her life forever. The barrier had been broken, and what remained was an abyss of possibilities, frightening and tempting. Ji-woo felt a lump in her throat, her hands clenching in her lap. I don't know what to say, sir," she managed to stammer, her voice hoarse. The idea of accepting such monumental help from her employer was as alien as the idea of flying. Her pride, built on years of self-sufficiency and hard work, rose like a wall. I've always taken care of everything myself. I can't accept something like this. It's too much." Jae-hyun watched her, understanding in his deep eyes. He knew it wouldn't be easy for her to accept. "Ji-woo, I understand your hesitation," he said, his voice calm and patient, without a hint of pressure. "But think carefully. You're not accepting something like this. You are allowing someone who has the means to lighten a burden you shouldn't carry alone. You didn't ask for it. You didn't seek it. I am offering it." He tilted his head slightly. "And I wouldn't do this if I didn't believe it was the right thing to do." She shook her head slowly, the tears she had held back now silently streaming down her face. "But why me? I'm your housekeeper, sir. I'm paid to do my job, not to have my problems solved by you." The hierarchy, though tenuous, was still a powerful force in her mind, dictating the boundaries of what was acceptable. Jae-hyun sighed softly, an almost inaudible sound. "Because you are a good person, Ji-woo, and because I saw you. I saw your struggle, your dedication, your dignity. I don't just see the housekeeper, I see Kim Ji-woo." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "And to be honest, because I can, and because perhaps I need to do something like this, to see life through a different lens." His eyes met hers, and there was a sincerity so raw that Ji-woo felt a shiver. "Money isn't everything, Ji-woo, but it can alleviate suffering, and if I can do that for someone who deserves it, why shouldn't I?" His logic was irrefutable, but emotion choked her. The image of her aunt, pale and frail in the hospital bed, flashed in her mind. The bills accumulating, the constant pressure, the exhaustion that gnawed at her soul. She was at her breaking point. Pride was a luxury she perhaps could no longer afford. I don't know what this means," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, gesturing towards the offer. What do you expect in return?" Distrust was a defense mechanism as deeply ingrained as her resilience. In her world, nothing came for free. Jae-hyun smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, but softened the tension in his face. "I hope you can breathe, Ji-woo. I hope you can have peace, that your aunt can have the best treatment without you having to sacrifice yourself to exhaustion. And perhaps I hope you'll allow me to be a part of it in some way." He reached out again, this time for the cake, and cut a slice. "Eat a piece of your birthday cake, Ji-woo. And think, there's no rush for an answer. But know that the offer is genuine, and that I didn't make it lightly." He placed the plate with the cake in front of her. The sweet scent of chocolate, once a comfort, now seemed almost ironic given the magnitude of the conversation. Ji-woo looked at the cake, then at Jae-hyun. The seriousness on his face, the absence of any malice or obvious ulterior motives, disarmed her. He wasn't demanding anything, just offering a way out, a hope. The kitchen was silent again, but the silence was different. It was no longer the silence of solitude, nor that of hierarchical tension. It was the silence of a crossroads, of a decision that could redefine her life. Ji-woo felt the weight of the offer, the promise of relief, and the vertigo of an uncertain future. She knew that, whether she accepted or not, her life would never be the same. The barrier had been broken, and the path ahead, though daunting, was the first time in a long time it didn't seem completely dark. Ji-woo looked at the slice of cake before her, the dark, inviting chocolate, and then at Jae-hyun. The hand he had used to cut the cake rested on the table, his fingers long and elegant. He wasn't looking at her with expectation, but with a calm that disarmed her even further. It was as if he had planted a seed of hope in her heart and was now patiently waiting for it to germinate. The vertigo was overwhelming. Years of struggle, of sleepless nights, of tight budgeting, all of it could disappear. The idea was so strange, so outside her reality, that it felt like a fever dream. Her pride, which had kept her standing for so long, now felt like a heavy burden, an armor that prevented her from reaching salvation. "Sir," she began, her voice almost a whisper, not knowing how to continue. Words tangled in her throat. How could she refuse an offer that could save her aunt? How could she accept something so grand from someone she barely knew, who was her employer? Jae-hyun watched her, his eyes conveying a silent understanding. "You don't have to say anything now, Ji-woo," he intervened softly, as if reading her thoughts. "I know it's a lot to process. Just consider it. Think of your aunt. Think of yourself." The tears she had held back with so much effort returned, stronger now. A single drop traced a warm path down her cheek. She couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at her with such genuineness, without judgment, without visible ulterior motives. It was a strange and unsettling sensation. I don't know what you would gain from this," she managed to ask again. Distrust still a persistent echo. It was the only way she knew to protect herself. Jae-hyun tilted his head, a faint, melancholic smile playing on his lips. "Perhaps I gain the chance to see someone who deserves a little peace, finally find it," he replied, his voice low. "Perhaps I gain the chance to do something that truly matters, beyond accumulating more zeros in a bank account. Money, by itself, is empty, Ji-woo, but how we use it, that can have meaning." He paused, his eyes fixed on the cake. "I've spent most of my life building an empire, Ji-woo, and in the process perhaps I've lost sight of what truly matters. Seeing your dedication, your strength, your struggle. It made me question many things. It made me see that there's more to life than the golden walls I've built around myself." The confession, so personal and unexpected, struck Ji-woo with the force of a revelation. She never imagined that the millionaire Lee Jae-hyun could have his own internal battles, his own search for meaning. He wasn't just offering help, he was, in some way, seeking something for himself as well. "It's not a transaction, Ji-woo," he continued, his voice now firmer but still gentle. It's a desire for humanity, for connection, to see a burden eased. I want nothing in return beyond knowing that you and your aunt are well." The silence returned to the kitchen, but this time it was a silence laden with a new intimacy. The hierarchy, once an insurmountable barrier, seemed to have dissolved into a mutual understanding, a shared vulnerability. Ji-woo looked at the cake, then at the candle that still burned, its flickering flame reflecting in her tear-filled eyes. She reached out hesitantly, not for the cake, but for the candle, and with a soft breath extinguished the flame. The small wisp of smoke rose, dissipating into the air. It was a simple gesture, but laden with symbolism. The wish she had made, selfish and profound, that the burden would become lighter, now seemed within her reach, offered by a man who, until a few hours ago, was merely her employer. The kitchen was dark, except for the soft moonlight streaming through the window and the faint glow of the digital clock on the stove. I need some time to think, sir," she finally managed to say, her voice thick with emotion, but with a new resolve. It was the first time she hadn't refused immediately. It was the first time she allowed herself to consider the possibility. Jae-hyun nodded, a small smile of relief and understanding gracing his face. "Of course, Ji-woo, take all the time you need, but know that the offer stands, and I'll be here." He stood up slowly, the chair scraping softly on the floor. The social barrier hadn't disappeared completely, but it had been permanently altered. He was no longer just the distant millionaire. He was a man who had offered a hand, and perhaps a new perspective on life. Ji-woo remained seated, looking at the untouched cake, her heart pounding with a dizzying mix of fear and a hope she dared not name. The path ahead was still daunting, but now there was a light, however faint, pointing the way. Jae-hyun stood up slowly, the chair scraping softly on the floor, a sound that echoed in the quiet kitchen. He didn't rush, giving her space, but also marking the end of that intense conversation. His eyes met hers one last time, and Ji-woo saw there not only the understanding he had promised, but also a hint of vulnerability, a silent wish for her to accept, not for him, but for herself. "Good night, Ji-woo," he said, his voice a little lower than usual, almost a whisper. And Happy birthday again." He turned and walked towards the kitchen door, his steps firm, yet unhurried. Ji-woo watched him disappear down the dark hallway, and the soft click of the door closing was the signal that she was alone again. But the solitude now was different. It was no longer the emptiness that accompanied her on past birthdays, but a space filled by the magnitude of the offer, by her employer's unexpected sincerity. The tears she had held back for so long returned with full force. They weren't tears of sadness or despair, but of an overwhelming confusion, of a relief that felt too dangerous to be real. She brought her hands to her face, feeling the warm dampness on her palms. Her mind reeled with his words. "It's not a transaction, Ji-woo. It's a desire for humanity, for connection. Humanity, connection. Words she rarely associated with her own life, much less with the life of a man like Lee Jae-hyun. He had revealed himself in a way she never imagined, exposing a part of himself that seemed so distant from the public image of the ruthless magnate. He had spoken of emptiness, of seeking meaning, of seeing life through a different lens, and that lens, somehow, had focused on her. Ji-woo looked at the slice of cake before her, the dark, inviting chocolate, but now completely unappealing. The wish she had made when extinguishing the candle, that the burden would become lighter, now hung over her like a cloud, an almost palpable promise. But accepting meant tearing down the barriers she had built throughout her life, the barriers of pride, of forced independence, of distrust. It meant accepting help from someone who was on a completely different social plane, someone who, in her world, had no reason for such generosity. The image of her aunt, pale and frail, returned to haunt her. The machines beeping, the nurses rushing, the constant threat that treatment could be halted if bills weren't paid. The weight of debt was a monster that pursued her day and night, stealing her sleep, her energy, her very essence. And now Lee Jae-hyun, the man she served, was offering to slay that monster. She couldn't move. The kitchen chair, once a refuge, now seemed a throne of judgment. What would she do? How could she refuse something that meant her aunt's life and well-being? But how could she accept without feeling that she was selling a part of herself, that she was becoming dependent, breaking all the unspoken rules of her existence? The night wore on, and Ji-woo remained there, the cake untouched, the candle extinguished, the silence of the kitchen filled only by the whirlwind of her own thoughts. She knew there was no easy answer. The decision she faced wasn't just about money. It was about dignity, about pride, about the meaning of help and the complexity of human relationships. It was about redefining her own life, and perhaps Lee Jae-hyun's life too. The path ahead, though now illuminated by a faint hope, was more frightening than any darkness she had ever faced. The sound of the door closing was the final seal of solitude, but Ji-woo knew it wasn't the same solitude as before. The kitchen, once a sanctuary for her small, secret rituals, now seemed a stage where an impossible drama had been enacted. She was still sitting, her hands damp with tears on her face, the cake untouched before her. Jae-hyun's words echoed in her mind, a dissonant chorus of hope and dread. "It's not a transaction, Ji-woo. It's a desire for humanity, for connection. Humanity, connection." She laughed, a dry, humorless sound that was lost in the silence. What humanity could there be between her, the housekeeper, and him, the magnate? What connection could exist that wasn't defined by the thin line of service and hierarchy? Her entire life had been built on the premise that these barriers were insurmountable, that her place was to serve, not to be served, much less to be saved. But the image of her aunt, thin and pale in the hospital bed, was a brutal counterpoint to any pride she might possess. The smell of disinfectant, the constant hum of the machines, the doctor's voice explaining the rising costs. The debt was an abyss, and she was on its edge, exhausted with no more strength to fight. Lee Jae-hyun, the man she saw as a distant, almost mythical figure, had extended a hand across that abyss. She stood up abruptly, the chair scraping on the floor, a sound that made her flinch. She began to pace the kitchen, her steps echoing. What did he really want? No one gave anything for free, especially someone like him. There was always a price. Would it be her dignity, her independence? The very essence of who she was, forged in years of hard work and silent sacrifice. How could I accept without feeling that I was selling a part of myself? The question, which she had asked herself countless times, now took on a terrifying urgency. Accepting meant admitting weakness, acknowledging that she couldn't do it alone, and above all, it meant becoming dependent on someone she barely knew, someone who lived in a world she could never even dream of touching. She stopped by the window, looking out at the dark garden, where the moonlight silvered the leaves of the trees. Jae-hyun's life was a well-tended garden, protected and abundant. Hers, an arid field, where every sprout of hope was a struggle. He had spoken of emptiness, of seeking meaning. She had a meaning, her aunt, her family, survival. Her emptiness was the absence of resources, of time, of peace. The hours dragged on. The digital clock on the stove changed from 0000 to 0100, then to 0200. Jiwoo couldn't lie down. Every fiber of her being was at war. Her pride screamed for her to refuse, to continue fighting alone, to maintain her independence at all costs. But a softer, more desperate voice whispered about her aunt, about the possibility of seeing her smile again, of easing her pain. Jae-hyun's offer wasn't just money, it was a chance at life. And to refuse it, however much her pride ached, would be an act of selfishness she couldn't bear. She wasn't just deciding about herself, but about her aunt's future. Slowly, Jiwoo returned to the table. The cake was still there, a silent reminder of the wish she had made, that the burden would become lighter. Cruel irony that the answer to that wish came from such an unexpected and complex source. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the cake. The chocolate was cold. The decision was no longer whether she would accept or not, but how. How could she accept without losing herself? How could she navigate this new and dangerous landscape of gratitude and dependence? The sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and orange. A new day, and with it, the certainty that she could no longer ignore the offer. She would have to face him again. She would have to talk to him. The path ahead was daunting, yes, but the darkness of debt and despair was even more terrifying. Jiwoo knew that for her aunt, she would do anything, even if it meant breaking all the rules she had set for herself, even if it meant risking her heart and her dignity in a game she didn't understand. She remained there, in the kitchen, now bathed in the pale morning light, feeling the weight of every hour that had passed. The exhaustion was not just physical, but of the soul. The internal battle had ceased, not by victory, but by surrender. Pride, however wounded, could not compete with the image of her aunt, slowly wasting away. Her aunt's life was worth more than any barrier Jiwoo could erect. With a heavy sigh, Jiwoo stood up. Her muscles were stiff, her mind hazy, but a new clarity, cold and determined, had settled. Accepting was not a defeat, but a survival strategy. It was not about selling herself, but about buying time, buying her aunt's life. The how was still a monster to be faced, but the if had been resolved. She began to tidy the kitchen, an automatic ritual that helped her organize her thoughts. The birthday cake, now dry and unappealing, was put away. The candle, a silent reminder of a wish that had become a complex reality, was discarded. Every movement was deliberate, every action a step towards the inevitable. She needed a strategy, words that could express her gratitude without sounding subservient, her acceptance without appearing desperate. She needed to maintain her dignity, even as she was putting it at risk. Meanwhile, in his upstairs bedroom, Lee Jae-hyun had also had a restless night. He hadn't slept deeply, Ji-woo's words and his own echoing in his mind. He wondered if he had been too abrupt, if his offer, however well-intentioned, had been an even greater burden for her. He had seen the confusion in her eyes, the silent struggle. Upon rising, Jae-hyun felt a strange mix of apprehension and hope. He wasn't accustomed to waiting for answers, much less for one that could redefine the dynamic of his own life. He had exposed a part of himself he guarded closely, revealing a vulnerability that surprised him. He didn't want her to feel obligated, but he wanted her to accept. Not for him, but for her aunt, for the chance of a less burdened life. He dressed with his usual precision, but there was a tension in his shoulders, an anticipation he couldn't shake. Breakfast would be the next battlefield, or perhaps the beginning of a truce. He wondered if she would appear, if she would avoid him, or if she would come with an answer. Ji-woo finished tidying the kitchen, the scent of fresh coffee beginning to spread. She looked at herself in the dark reflection of the window. Her eyes were red, but there was a new determination in them. She was no longer the woman who cried silently over a birthday cake. She was the woman who would do whatever it took for her family. With her heart pounding in her chest, she climbed the stairs. Every step was a stride towards an uncertain future, a future where the lines between housekeeper and employer, between help and dependence, would be irrevocably blurred. She knew the conversation would be difficult, that the questions would be many, and that the answers might not be easy to find, but she was ready. For her aunt, she was ready to face Lee Jae-hyun, and the new world his offer had opened. The path ahead was not just daunting, it was a crossing into the unknown, and she had no idea what awaited her on the other side. When Ji-woo reached the upstairs, she found Jae-hyun in the dining room, seated at the head of the long mahogany table, with a newspaper open before him. He wasn't reading. His eyes were fixed on the door, as if anticipating her arrival. The air in the room was dense, laden with expectation. He looked up when she entered, and for an instant, the silence between them was almost deafening. "Good morning, Mr. Lee," Ji-woo said, her voice a little hoarse from the sleepless night, but firm. She stood at a respectful distance, her hands clasped in front, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. Jae-hyun slowly closed the newspaper, setting it aside. His eyes, usually so distant, now watched her with an intensity that made her hold her breath. "Good morning, Ji-woo," he replied, his voice calm, but with a note of something she couldn't quite identify. Did you sleep well?" The question was a formality, but also an opening. Ji-woo knew she couldn't lie. "No, Mr. Lee, not much. I thought a lot about what we discussed." He nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "I imagined as much." He gestured to the chair across from him, a silent invitation. "Please, sit down. We can talk while you have your coffee." Ji-woo hesitated for a moment. Sitting at the table with him as an equal was a breach of protocol that made her uncomfortable, but she knew this conversation couldn't be held standing like a housekeeper receiving orders. She needed her dignity. With a slight nod, she pulled out the chair and sat down, maintaining an upright posture, her hands still clasped. The coffee was already served, hot and aromatic. I accept your offer, Mr. Lee," she began, getting straight to the point, before her courage deserted her. The phrase came out easier than she expected, but its weight was immense. "For my aunt, but—" Jae-hyun interrupted her, a small smile gracing his lips, a smile that seemed more of relief than triumph. "But," he prompted, his voice gentle. He seemed to understand that her acceptance would come with conditions, with the need to preserve her essence. The game, she realized, was only just beginning. But, Jiwoo continued, her voice gaining strength, I need you to understand some things. I cannot accept this as charity, Mr. Lee. I am not a beggar. I am a worker, and I need to maintain my dignity. Jae-hyun listened attentively, the expression on his face softening. He didn't seem surprised by her conditions, but rather almost relieved that she had articulated them. I understand, Jiwoo, and I wouldn't expect anything less from you. It's not charity, it's an investment in a person I deeply respect. He paused, his eyes fixed on hers. I've seen your dedication, your strength. It's not something one finds every day, and I believe you deserve a chance to live without the overwhelming burden you carry. An investment? She repeated, her brow furrowed. The word was strange in the context, but it didn't sound as humiliating as charity. Yes, he confirmed. Consider it a loan if that makes you feel more comfortable. Interest-free, with no fixed term. You'll repay it when you can, if you can, or consider it a bonus for years of impeccable service, a recognition of your worth that goes beyond the salary you receive. He leaned forward slightly, his voice lower, more intimate. What I truly want, Jiwoo, is for you and your aunt to have the peace you deserve, for you to be able to focus on her recovery, without the constant shadow of debt. Jiwoo felt a lump in her throat. His words were unexpected, kind in a way she wasn't accustomed to. He wasn't just offering money, he was offering understanding, respect, and what do you expect in return? She asked, her voice almost a whisper. It was the question that had plagued her since he made the offer. Jae-hyun smiled again, a small, genuine smile he rarely showed. I hope you accept that you use this help for what is most important. And perhaps, he added, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her blush slightly, that you allow me to continue to get to know you, not as your employer, but as someone who cares. The revelation hit her with the force of a wave. Someone who cares. The barrier she had meticulously built over the years, between her personal life and her work, between her and her employer, was crumbling, brick by brick. It was dangerous, but also incredibly tempting. I don't know what to say, she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. Don't say anything yet, he said, raising a hand. Just think about it. But know that my offer is sincere, and that there are no strings attached that compromise your dignity. I value that in you more than anything. He gestured to the coffee and to a small basket of bread and fruit she had prepared. Please, eat something. You look exhausted. Jiwoo looked at the food, then at him. The hunger she hadn't felt for hours began to assert itself. She picked up a piece of toast, her fingers trembling slightly. The silence returned to fill the room, but now it was a different silence, less tense, more thoughtful. She knew this was a point of no return. Accepting Lee Jae-hyun's help meant more than just alleviating her aunt's debt. It meant opening a door to a relationship that challenged all the conventions she knew. It meant risking her heart in a world she didn't understand. But looking at the steaming coffee cup, feeling the warmth in her hands, she realized that the darkness of despair was an even greater risk. For her aunt, she was willing to take that risk. For her own life, perhaps too. Thank you, Mr. Lee, she said, her voice a little stronger now. I accept, and I will do my best to honor your trust. Jae-hyun nodded, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. I know you will, Jiwoo. I know you will. He picked up his own coffee cup, and for a moment they sat there, the millionaire and the housekeeper, sharing breakfast in a silence that spoke of an uncertain future, yet one full of possibilities. The path ahead was unknown, but for the first time in a long time, Jiwoo felt a glimmer of hope. The silence that followed was no longer oppressive, but rather filled with the reverberation of exchanged words. Jiwoo chewed her toast, the taste of bread and butter seeming more real, more present than in any other meal she had had in Lee Jae-hyun's house. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a new layer of perception. She felt the warmth of the coffee in her hands, the weight of the decision in her chest, and the strange lightness of hope that was beginning to sprout. Jae-hyun watched her discreetly over the rim of his cup. He noticed the way she held the toast, the slight tremor in her fingers that now seemed to have subsided. There was a new serenity on her face, one he rarely saw. The relief in his own chest was palpable. He had risked much, exposed a part of himself he guarded closely, and she had accepted, not blindly, but with the dignity he so admired. "About the details," Jae-hyun began, breaking the silence with a soft voice. "I've already instructed my lawyer to take care of everything. He will contact the hospital directly. You won't have to worry about bureaucracy or the pressure from creditors." Ji-woo looked up surprised. "Already?" He nodded. "I had a strong intuition you would accept. And, in any case, it was something I wanted to do, regardless of your answer. The difference is that now you are aware and agree." He paused. "I also suggested that they not inform her about the origin of the help, unless you explicitly ask, to avoid any unnecessary embarrassment." His consideration struck her deeply. He wasn't just offering money, he was protecting her reputation, her privacy. I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Lee." "There's no need to thank me," he replied with a slight wave of his hand. "Just take care of your aunt, and take care of yourself." He looked at her with an intensity that made her heart pound again. "I would like you to take a few days off, to go to the hospital, to spend time with her, to organize your thoughts. The house can wait." The offer of time off, something she would never have dared to ask for, was another sign of the change. "But the work?" "The work will be here when you return." Jae-hyun interrupted gently. "Your aunt is more important, and you need time to process all of this. I understand it's a lot to take in." Ji-woo felt her eyes well up. Years of pressure seemed to be unraveling, and the emotion was overwhelming. She blinked rapidly, trying to maintain her composure. I thank you very much, Mr. Lee. I will do that." He smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his eyes. "Good. And Ji-woo," he continued, his voice lowering a tone, "about what I said before, about wanting to get to know you. I am sincere. There's no rush, no expectations, just a desire to see you flourish, to see the person behind the tireless dedication." She felt the blush rise to her face again. That was the most delicate, the most frightening point. How could she navigate this new frontier? The idea of a romance with her employer was as absurd as it was dangerous, but the sincerity in his eyes was undeniable. I don't know what that means, Mr. Lee," she admitted, her voice almost a whisper. I never thought of anything like that." "And you don't have to think about it now," he said, with an understanding that surprised her. "Just allow things to happen naturally. Allow yourself to breathe. For now, focus on your aunt. And when you're ready, perhaps we can have another coffee together. Not as employer and employee, but as two people." He stood up from the table, the newspaper still untouched beside him. "I have a meeting this morning. Please feel free to stay here as long as you need, and don't worry about breakfast. I can help myself." Ji-woo watched him as he walked away, the tall, elegant figure disappearing down the hallway. She remained seated there, alone in the vast dining room, the scent of coffee and the promise of an uncertain future hanging in the air. The toast in her hand seemed heavy again, but now it was the weight of responsibility for a new life, not the weight of despair. She had accepted, she had taken a step into the unknown, and for the first time in a long time, Kim Ji-woo felt that perhaps, just perhaps, she could have something more than just survive. She could live, and the prospect, though terrifying, was also incredibly liberating. The path ahead was a haze, but the darkness had receded and a ray of sunshine was beginning to break through. Ji-woo remained seated at the table, the coffee cooling in her cup, the toast untouched in her hand. The room, once a stage for tension and despair, now seemed different, lighter perhaps. Jae-hyun's absence was not an emptiness, but a space filled with the reverberations of his words, of his unexpected kindness. She touched the simple ring on her finger, an old habit when she was nervous or thoughtful. The dignity she so cherished had been recognized, not crushed. The offer of time off, of going to see her aunt without the shadow of debt, was a gift she could barely conceive. She stood up slowly, feeling her body still heavy, but her mind strangely clear. The house seemed silent, but not lonely. There was a new energy in the air, a promise. Determined to act, Ji-woo went up to her room, changed out of her uniform into civilian clothes, and picked up her small bag. On her way to the door, she hesitated. Should she leave a note, thank him again? But Jae-hyun had told her not to thank him. He had told her to take care of herself and her aunt. And that was what she would do. The journey to the hospital was different. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the oppressive weight of anxiety with every turn. The urban landscape, once grey and indifferent, seemed to have gained a little colour. Upon arriving, the smell of antiseptic and the atmosphere of concern was still there, but the pang of despair that accompanied her had lessened. She found her aunt, Mrs. Kim, sitting in bed, reading a book. Her face was pale, but her eyes a little brighter. Ji-woo, what a pleasant surprise. I didn't expect you so soon. Ji-woo sat in the chair beside the bed, taking her aunt's wrinkled hand. I came to see you, and I have news. She took a deep breath, Jae-hyun's words echoing in her mind. The hospital debt, it's been paid. Mrs. Kim dropped her book, her eyes wide. Paid? How? Ji-woo, what did you do? There was a mix of hope and fear in the elderly woman's voice. It wasn't me, Aunt, Ji-woo hastened to explain, a genuine smile gracing her lips. A benefactor, someone who learned of our situation and decided to help, without expecting anything in return. She omitted the details, protecting Jae-hyun's privacy and her own, as he had suggested. Tears welled in Mrs. Kim's eyes. An angel in heaven heard us. I prayed so much, my dear. She squeezed Ji-woo's hand, emotion overflowing. This is a miracle. Ji-woo felt a lump in her throat, but this time they were tears of relief and gratitude. Seeing her so happy, so relieved, was the greatest gift. Yes, Aunt, it's a miracle. And the doctor said you're progressing well. Now, without this worry, you can focus on getting strong and coming home. They spent hours talking, laughing, planning a future that once seemed impossible. Mrs. Kim spoke of the small things she wanted to do, the foods she wanted to eat. Ji-woo listened, her heart light, feeling the weight of years of worry finally dissipate. Upon returning to the mansion in the late afternoon, the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple. The house was silent, but not empty. There was a new atmosphere, a promise of change. She went up to her room, took off her clothes, and took a warm bath, feeling the physical tension drain away. As she lay down, Ji-woo looked at the ceiling, the image of Jae-hyun, his genuine smile, his words about wanting to get to know her and allowing things to happen naturally, returned to her mind. It was frightening, yes, a world she never imagined, a connection that challenged everything she knew. But for the first time, the fear wasn't paralyzing. It was mixed with a curiosity, a timid hope. She didn't know what the future held. The line between employer and employee had been blurred, perhaps even erased. The path ahead was uncertain, full of challenges and new emotions. But as she closed her eyes, Ji-woo felt a profound peace. The darkness of despair had been replaced by a glimmer of light. She had accepted the help, had taken a step into the unknown. She could live. The improbable romance had begun, not with a grand gesture, but with the quietness of a shared breakfast and the promise of a future where dignity and love could finally coexist.